The word she chose was older than the mansion, older than the family name carved into the marble above the door, older than every gun hidden in every drawer of the Belandi estate. She stood inside the private study on the second floor, her hands still smelling like pine soap and bleach, her curvy frame swallowed by the shadow of a bookshelf that reached the ceiling. In the leather chair by the window sat Don Matteo Belandi, 78 years old, silent for 4 years, staring at nothing the way a man stares at a photograph he has already burned. Delia Russo did not know she was going to speak until she already had. One word. Sicilian, not Italian, sharp on the tongue like a lemon rind. Sciarreri. The old man's head turned, slowly, and his eyes, gray as harbor water, filled with something no one in that house had seen in almost half a decade. Downstairs, a wine glass shattered on tile. Somewhere in the hall, a bodyguard drew his weapon before he knew why. And in the front parlor, the current boss of the family, Salvatore Belandi, stopped mid-sentence and looked up at the ceiling as if it had spoken to him. Who was this cleaning woman, and what did she know that no one else in the entire Belandi bloodline had dared to say out loud? Delia Russo had taken the job for 2 reasons, and neither of them was money, though the money was a small miracle. She was 34 years old, a widow for 6 of those years, and until the previous Tuesday, she had been scrubbing hospice bathrooms in a nursing home outside White Plains that smelled like boiled cabbage and sorrow. Her husband, Nicky, a good man with a bad heart, had left her nothing but a rent-controlled apartment in Queens and a shoebox of unpaid medical bills. The agency called her on a Monday morning. Belandi Estate, they said. Long Island. Discreet. No questions. Cash. Delia had heard the name before, whispered in the produce aisle at Arthur Avenue when she was a girl, spoken with the same careful reverence her Nonna Graziella had used for saints and thunderstorms. She should have said no. Any sensible woman would have said no. But her Nonna, dead now 11 years, had raised her on Sicilian dialect and Sicilian courage, taught her that a woman who bent her head to bad men was already halfway dug into her own grave. And Delia had spent too many years cleaning up after people who thought a woman with hips and a soft voice was the same as a woman without spine. Her rent was 3 weeks late. Her refrigerator held a jar of olives and half a loaf of stale bread. The agency woman on the phone had said the family paid in cash on Fridays. No taxes, no paperwork, no look-backs. Delia had listened, and she had heard something else underneath that offer. Some quiet, insistent voice she had not heard since her Nonna's funeral. She took the job. She did not tell the agency about her grandmother. She did not tell them about the word. And she did not tell them because she did not yet know herself that the word was already waiting for her in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet, patient as an old cat. The estate itself was hidden behind a low stone wall in a village where the police cars drove slower and the mailmen never knocked. On her first morning, Delia parked her old Buick behind a row of black SUVs and stood for a moment on the gravel drive, taking in the cypress trees, the fountain that did not run, the enormous front door with its brass lion knocker gone green at the edges. A tall man in a charcoal suit met her at the threshold without smiling. He was in his late 30s, with the kind of shoulders that came from lifting things heavier than dumbbells, and eyes the color of wet slate. This, she would learn, was Salvatore Belandi. He did not shake her hand. He did not welcome her. He simply said, "You clean. You do not speak to my father. You do not enter the East Wing. You do not answer the phone. If you break any of these rules, you leave the property in a way you will not enjoy." Delia looked at him, this man who was clearly the boss of a house that ate people alive, and she said, quietly and without fear, "Yes, sir." He studied her a moment longer, then stepped aside. She walked past him into the marble foyer, and she felt his gaze on her back the entire way. The house was beautiful in the way a mausoleum is beautiful. Everything shone, nothing moved. The rugs were Persian, the paintings were originals, the flowers on the hall table were fresh, and yet the whole place felt as if something had died in it, and no one had been brave enough to name what. The other staff, a stooped cook named Fausta, and a groundskeeper named Mario, who never looked up from his shears, taught her the rules with hand gestures and averted eyes. Do not laugh in the halls. Do not open the closed doors. Do not linger near the study on the second floor, where the old Don sat all day like a stopped clock. On her third morning, Delia broke that rule by accident. She was carrying a basket of lemon-scented linens down the wrong corridor when she passed the study door and heard, from inside, a sound so small it might have been a moth against glass. She stopped. She listened. It came again. It was a hum. Just a note, low and cracked, but a note. And Delia recognized the tune. It was a Sicilian lullaby her grandmother had sung to her every night for 17 years. She stood in that hallway with her arms full of linens and her heart in her throat, and she thought, "This old man is not silent. This old man is hiding." She did not open the door that morning. She was not yet foolish. But that night, back in her apartment in Queens with the radiator ticking, she pulled down a shoebox from the top of her closet, the one her Nona had left her, and she went through it for the first time in years. Photographs, a rosary, a pressed olive leaf, a ration book from 1943, and near the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, a small notebook filled with her grandmother's slanted handwriting. Sicilian proverbs, recipes, a list of names Delia had never asked about. And there, in the middle, underlined twice in blue ink, was a single word, Chiareri. In the margin beside it, her grandmother had written, in English, "The word we use when the truth has been buried in shame, and it is time to dig." Delia sat on her kitchen floor with the notebook on her lap and stared at that word for a long time. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, she drove back to the estate, and she carried the notebook in the pocket of her apron. For the next several days, she cleaned. She dusted the tops of frames no one had touched in years. She washed the crystal, one glass at a time. She learned the rhythm of the house, the way Salvatore came and went in the black car at 7 and returned after midnight, the way a thin man in an expensive suit named Vincenzo Palermo arrived every afternoon at 3 and stayed for exactly 1 hour in the parlor with a leather briefcase, the way the guards on the gate changed shifts at 8 and 2. She learned that Don Matteo was carried down to the garden every Sunday at 10 and returned to his chair at 11. She learned that no one, not even Salvatore, entered the study without knocking 3 times. And she learned, from a whispered conversation between Fausta and Mario in the pantry, that the old Don had gone silent the day his wife, Rosaria, had been found dead at the bottom of the marble staircase in the front foyer, 4 years ago that August, and that no one in the family spoke her name anymore. On her 9th morning at the estate, Delia knocked on the study door, 3 times. She did not wait to be told to come in. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it softly behind her. Don Matteo was in his chair by the window, a wool blanket over his knees despite the July heat. He turned his head at the sound. His eyes, which had been so empty the first time she glimpsed them through a crack in the door, sharpened. He was not surprised to see her. He seemed, in fact, to have been waiting. She set the basket of linens on the floor. She walked to the window. She looked out at the garden below, where a bronze statue of a woman held a bowl of dry stone flowers. And without turning to look at him, she said the word, Chiareri. Behind her, she heard him draw in a breath, as if he had been holding it for 4 years. She heard the wool blanket slide from his knees to the floor. She heard him say, in a voice like a hinge that had rusted shut and been forced open, one word back to her, Rosaria. That was the moment the wineglass fell downstairs. That was the moment the guard drew his gun. That was the moment Salvatore, in the parlor with Vincenzo Palermo, went pale and stood up. Salvatore was on the second-floor landing within 90 seconds. He threw open the study door with the flat of his hand, and Delia turned to face him with her back to his father, calm as a woman who had already accepted whatever came next. Behind her, Don Matteo sat forward in his chair for the first time in years, his knotted hand gripping the armrest, his gray eyes wet and awake. Salvatore looked at his father. He looked at Delia. He looked at his father again. And in a voice so quiet it was more dangerous than a shout, he said, "What did you do?" Delia did not lie. She did not shrink. She said, I spoke to him in the language he was married in. Salvatore took a step toward her. Behind him, Vincenzo Palermo had appeared in the doorway, the leather briefcase still in his hand, his thin face composed, but his eyes doing something quick and calculating. It was Vincenzo who said smoothly, "Salvatore, she is the help. Have her escorted out." But Don Matteo, from the chair by the window, made a sound. Not a word this time. A growl, low and animal. His eyes were fixed on Vincenzo, and they were not kind. Salvatore saw it. Salvatore turned back to Delia and said in a very different voice, "You will stay. You will not leave this estate until I say. Do you understand?" Delia nodded once. Vincenzo Palermo smiled with only his mouth, and that, though none of them knew it yet, was the moment the house began to come apart. They put her in a small room in the servants' wing that night, and a guard was posted at her door. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her grandmother's notebook open on her knees, reading and rereading the pages, trying to understand what her Nonna had known. There was a name written on the inside of the back cover that she had not noticed before. Rosaria Vitale. Delia's breath caught. Vitale had been her grandmother's maiden name. She had grown up on Vitale bread, Vitale stories, Vitale saints, and Rosaria, the dead wife of Don Matteo Belandi, had also been a Vitale. Delia pressed the notebook to her chest and understood, in that small, dim room, that her grandmother had not sent her here by accident. Nonna Graziella had been dead 11 years, but Nonna Graziella had left a shoebox and a notebook and a word. And Nonna Graziella had a cousin she rarely spoke of, who married into a family in Long Island. And Delia had been walking into this house since she was a little girl, in a hand-me-down dress on Arthur Avenue, eating a Vitale cannoli. She was not a stranger in the Belandi estate. She was a piece of it that had been missing. In the morning, Salvatore came to her room himself. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway with his suit jacket over his arm and his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he looked like a man who had not slept either. He said, "My father spoke your name twice in the night. He has not spoken any name in 4 years. I want to know how you did it." Delia set the notebook aside, stood, and faced him. She said, "Your mother was Rosaria Vitale. My grandmother was Graziella Vitale. They were cousins. My grandmother knew your mother when they were girls in a village outside Palermo. That word I used, sciareri, was a word only their family used. Your mother must have said it to your father. Your father heard my voice and thought for a moment she had come back." Salvatore stared at her. He did not move. Then he said quietly, "My father never told me my mother's family name. He erased it." Delia said, "Because someone in this house wanted it erased." Salvatore's jaw tightened. He said, "You are accusing." Delia said, "I am telling you what an old woman in a notebook already knew. Your mother did not fall down those stairs, Mr. Belandi. Someone in this family put her at the bottom of them, and your father knew it, and it broke his voice." Salvatore was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, and there was something in it that had not been there the day she arrived. He said, "Say her name again, my mother's name, the way you said it to my father." And Delia said, "Rosaria Vitale Belandi." He closed his eyes. He nodded once. Then he opened them and said, "You will not leave this house, not because you are a prisoner, because if what you say is true, there is a man in this family who has been sitting at my dinner table for 12 years, and I need you to help me find out which one." Delia said, "I already know which one." Salvatore's head came up. Delia said, "Vincenzo Palermo carries a briefcase every afternoon at 3. He goes into the parlor. He does not come out with the same briefcase. I have been dusting that room for 8 days. There is a false back in the writing desk. I do not know what is in it, because I do not open what is not mine. But I know a man who trades briefcases in secret, and I know a man who smiles at a widow's photograph, and those two men are the same man." Salvatore looked at her as if he were seeing her truly, for the first time. He said, "You have been in my house 9 days." She said, "9 days is enough. A woman who cleans other people's homes learns to see what they hide." He almost smiled. It was the first almost smile she had seen from him, and it was gone in a second. That afternoon at 3, Vincenzo Palermo arrived at the estate as always, leather briefcase in hand, his thin smile arranged for the front hall. Salvatore met him in the parlor. Delia was dusting the crystal decanters on the sideboard, quiet as a shadow, apron neat, notebook safe in the pocket over her heart. Vincenzo did not seem to notice her, which was exactly what she wanted. He sat in the armchair he always sat in. He opened the briefcase. He and Salvatore spoke in low voices about a trucking contract, a shipment out of Newark, a name Delia did not recognize. When they were done, Vincenzo closed the briefcase, stood, shook Salvatore's hand, and left the room. Delia watched, still dusting, and she saw what she had seen every afternoon for a week. The briefcase Vincenzo carried out of the parlor was not the briefcase he had carried in. The leather was the same, the brass corners were the same, but there was a small ink mark on the handle of the second briefcase, a mark Delia had made herself on the third day with a pen she kept in her apron. She turned to Salvatore, who was still standing by the fireplace. She said only, "Now." He nodded. He went to the writing desk. He ran his hand along the underside of the top drawer. He found the small brass catch her grandmother's notebook had taught her about, the one every Vitale writing desk had been made with in the old country. He pressed it. The false back sprang open. Inside, folded neatly, was a ledger. Names, dates, amounts. Payments Vincenzo had been taking from a rival family for 12 years, and beneath the ledger, wrapped in an old lace handkerchief, was a heavy gold locket. Salvatore opened it. Inside was a photograph of his mother, and behind the photograph, tucked in, a lock of dark hair and a small folded note in his mother's handwriting that read, in Sicilian, "If I am found at the bottom of the stairs, it was Vincenzo. He asked me to keep his secret. I said no. Shareri." Salvatore did not speak for a long time. He held the locket in his hand and looked at his mother's face, and his shoulders, which had never bent in Delia's presence, bent a little. Delia stood very still by the sideboard and let him have his silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hard. He said, "He has been in this house for 12 years. Delia said, "Yes." He said, "He sat with my father in this room the night my mother died." Delia said, "Yes." He said, "He will come to the family dinner on Sunday." Delia said, "Yes." Salvatore closed the locket. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked at her. He said, "What would you do?" And Delia, 34 years old, widowed, curvy, a cleaning woman with lemon soap on her hands, said, "I would let him come. I would let him sit at the table where he sat that night. I would let him lift his wine glass. And then I would let your father say his name out loud, in front of every man in this family, in the language your mother spoke. And I would be ready for what he does next, because a man like that does not go quietly." Salvatore looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "You do not have to be there." Delia said, "Yes, I do. Your father will not speak unless I am in the room. He does not know it yet, but I do." Salvatore said, "It will be dangerous." Delia said, "I have been cleaning up after dangerous men my entire life. I am not afraid of one more." And this time Salvatore did smile. Small, brief, real. The next 3 days were the longest of Delia's life. She continued her cleaning. She dusted, she polished, she folded linens, she carried lemon-scented sheets up and down the back stairs, and she did not let her face show anything. Vincenzo Palermo came at 3 each afternoon and left with a different briefcase, and Delia marked each one with the little ink pen, and Salvatore replaced each ledger in the false back of the desk exactly as it had been. They did not want him to know. Not yet. Meanwhile, Delia sat with Don Matteo every morning for 1 hour. She did not push him to speak. She simply read to him from her grandmother's notebook, in Sicilian, the proverbs and the recipes and the small, strange prayers of a village neither of them had ever seen. On the second morning, He reached out with his knotted hand and took hers. His grip was weak, but it was there. On the third morning, he said, in a voice like dry leaves, "You look like her." Delia said, "I know." He said, "She trusted the wrong man." Delia said, "We are going to fix that on Sunday." He looked at her with his gray harbor water eyes and he said in Sicilian, "I will speak. One more time. For her. Then I am done." Delia squeezed his hand. She said, "One more time is all we need." Sunday came hot and heavy, the July air pressing against the windows of the estate like a hand. The dining room had been prepared since dawn. The long walnut table was set for 11. Silver, crystal, white linen, a low arrangement of white oleander down the center. The oleander was Delia's touch. Nonna Graziella had once told her that oleander was the flower of secrets kept too long. Salvatore had raised an eyebrow when he saw it, but had said nothing. The men began to arrive at 6. Cousins from Brooklyn, an uncle from Philadelphia, 2 captains from the trucking side, an accountant from the city, a priest who had baptized Salvatore and never asked what the family really did, and finally, at 6:30, Vincenzo Palermo, in a dove-gray suit with a red silk pocket square, smiling his thin smile, kissing the cheeks of every man in the room. He did not notice Delia, standing by the sideboard in a plain black dress and apron, her hair pinned up, her hands folded. Servants were furniture to him. That was the mistake he had always made. That was the mistake Delia was counting on. At 7, the double doors at the end of the dining room opened, and Salvatore wheeled his father in. A murmur went through the room. Don Matteo had not come to a family dinner in 4 years. Every man at the table stood. Some of them crossed themselves. Vincenzo Palermo stood too, but his smile had changed by a fraction, a tightening at the corners. Salvatore wheeled his father to the head of the table, in the seat that had been kept empty every Sunday since Rosaria died. He locked the wheels. He kissed his father's forehead. He sat at his father's right hand, and he said, in a voice that carried down the long table, "Tonight my father wishes to speak. We will listen." The men sat. The wine was poured. No one lifted a glass. Every eye in the room was on Don Matteo, who sat straight in his chair now, his blanket gone, his gray eyes moving slowly from face to face until they found Vincenzo Palermo, and there they stopped. Delia stepped forward from the sideboard. She did not look at anyone but the old man. She walked to his chair. She bent down. She placed her hand over his, and she said softly, in Sicilian, "Now, Don Matteo, sciareri." The old man drew a long breath. His voice, when it came, was cracked and quiet, but every man in the room leaned forward to hear it. He said, 4 years ago this August, my wife Rosaria Vitali Belandi was murdered in the front hall of this house. A hiss went through the table. He continued, "She was not alone when she died. There was a man with her. That man had asked her to hide a secret from me. That secret was that he had been taking money from the Corvetti family for 12 years and passing them the routes of our trucks. My wife refused. She told him she would tell me that night. He pushed her down the marble stairs. He waited until she was dead. Then he left through the garden gate. I know this because my wife wrote it in her own hand and put it in her locket, and this cleaning woman, whose grandmother was my wife's cousin, found the locket. That man is at this table tonight." The silence in the dining room was so complete that Delia could hear the low tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Every head turned, slowly, toward Vincenzo Palermo. Vincenzo's face had gone the color of old paper. He set down his wine glass with a hand that had begun to tremble. He said, laughing thinly, "This is madness, an old man's madness, a cleaning woman's lies." But Salvatore had already reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He set the locket on the white linen tablecloth. He set the ledger beside it. He said, "Read it, Vincenzo, out loud. Your name is on every page." Vincenzo looked at the locket. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the 11 men around the table, most of whom were now sitting very still with their hands out of sight below the linen. And then Vincenzo did what a cornered man does. He reached for the small pistol he had carried into every Belandi dinner for 12 years, tucked at the small of his back beneath the dove-gray suit. He drew it. He aimed it, not at Salvatore but at Don Matteo, because he knew, even in that final second, that the old man's voice was the only thing that could truly destroy him. Delia moved before she thought. She was standing beside Don Matteo's chair. She was closer to Vincenzo than any of the seated men. She grabbed the heavy crystal wine decanter from the sideboard behind her, spun, and swung it with everything her curvy, strong arms had. Arms that had lifted grown men out of hospice beds for 6 years. The decanter caught Vincenzo across the wrist just as he fired. The gun went off, but the shot went wild, splintering the plaster ceiling. The decanter shattered. Red wine and glass exploded across the white linen. Vincenzo howled, his wrist broken, and staggered back. 2 of the captains from the trucking side were on him before he could raise the gun again. They pinned him to the wall. Salvatore was on his feet, his own gun drawn now, but he did not fire, because Delia had already turned, already put her body between Vincenzo and Don Matteo, already shielded the old man with the width of her back and her outstretched arms, and if Vincenzo had gotten off another shot, it would have gone through her first. But Vincenzo did not get off another shot. The captains had him. His pistol clattered to the floor. The priest crossed himself. The accountant vomited quietly into a napkin, and Don Matteo, his blanket still gone, sat straight in his chair with tears running down his creased face, and he lifted his cracked voice one more time and said in Sicilian, "Take him out to the garden, to the gate he left through. Do what needs to be done, but do not bury him. Let the ground refuse him, as it refused my wife." The captains dragged Vincenzo Palermo out of the dining room. He was screaming, and then he was not. Delia did not turn to watch. She was on her knees beside Don Matteo's chair, holding his knotted hand in both of hers, and she was crying, and he was crying, and Salvatore stood behind them with his hand resting on his father's shoulder, and no one in that room spoke for a very long time. It was Fausta, the old cook, who finally came in and quietly began to clear the broken glass, her small, wrinkled hands moving with the practiced calm of a woman who had cleaned up after Belandi violence before and expected to clean up after it again. Mario, the groundskeeper, came for the wine-stained linen, folding it as gently as if it were a shroud. The other men rose one by one and came to Don Matteo, and they kissed his hand, and they kissed Delia's hand too, which was a thing that had not happened to a servant in that house in 100 years. The uncle from Philadelphia, an old man with a white mustache, held Delia's hand a long time and said in Sicilian, "Vitale blood, I should have known." The priest sat down at the far end of the table and began, softly, to pray, though for whom it was not clear. And Salvatore, when the room had emptied and only he and Delia and his father remained, knelt down on the other side of the wheelchair, and he took his father's other hand, and the 3 of them stayed like that until the July sun went down and the dining room went blue with dusk. Don Matteo lived 17 more days. He was tired, so tired, and the speaking had cost him more than he had left, the way a well that has been capped for 4 years costs itself when it is finally uncorked and made to give up its water. But those 17 days were not silent ones. He spoke to Salvatore, at last, the long, slow conversations of a father and son who had lost 4 years and were trying to gather back what could be gathered. He spoke to Delia every morning, in Sicilian, telling her the stories of a village outside Palermo where the lemon trees grew close to the sea, and 2 girls named Rosaria and Graziella had once shared a single pair of good shoes between them. He asked Delia to bring her grandmother's notebook to him, and he held it against his chest as he slept. On the 17th morning, Delia came to the study with his tea, and she found him in his chair by the window with his eyes closed and his hand resting on the notebook, and there was a small smile on his mouth she had never seen before. He had gone quietly, in the language he loved, in a room that no longer smelled of shame. They buried him beside Rosaria in the small cemetery behind the village church his family had built with quiet money 40 years before. Delia walked in the front row with Salvatore, and behind her walked Fausta and Mario, and every man who had sat at the dinner table, their heads bare in the August heat. She wore a black dress that fit her curves the way her nonna would have approved of, cut simply, with a small mother-of-pearl button at the collar, and she carried a single spray of white oleander wrapped in her grandmother's lace handkerchief. And when they lowered him into the ground, she dropped the flowers on the casket and she said, softly, in Sicilian, the word one more time. Sciareri. The truth had been unearthed. The shame had been buried in its place. Nonna Graziella, wherever she was, would have nodded once and gone back to her needlework, satisfied that the small, patient plan she had set in motion a decade before her own death had finally, in its own crooked time, come to rest. The Belandi estate was quieter after that, but not the dead quiet it had been. Fausta hummed in the kitchen now. Mario whistled in the garden. The fountain in the front drive was repaired, and it ran again for the first time in 4 years. Salvatore did not ask Delia to leave. She did not ask to stay. She simply stayed, and one afternoon in late August, when the light through the study windows was gold and long, he came and found her sitting in Don Matteo's old chair with the notebook open on her lap, and he sat down across from her, and he said, "I do not know how to do any of this without my father, and I do not know how to do any of it with a woman who is only here because a briefcase caught her eye." Delia closed the notebook. She looked at him steady, the way she had looked at him the first morning on the front steps. She said, "I did not come here for a briefcase. I did not stay for one either. I came because an old woman I loved put a word in my mouth 11 years ago and waited for me to be ready to say it. I stayed because a man who had not spoken in 4 years said my grandmother's cousin's name, and I could not walk away from that. If you want me to keep staying, Salvatore Belandi, you will have to ask me plainly, in the language your mother spoke, and you will have to mean it." He looked at her a long time. Then he said in careful, slow Sicilian that he had clearly been practicing in secret, "Delia Russo, stay." She smiled. She said in Sicilian, "That is a beginning." She did not marry him that year, or the next. She was a widow twice careful now, and he was a man with a name and a history and a great deal of quiet work to do to make his father's family clean again. She kept her apartment in Queens for a long time, the rent-controlled one with the ticking radiator and the small kitchen, where she had first read her grandmother's notebook on the floor. She drove out to the estate 3 days a week in a newer car Salvatore had quietly parked in front of her building one morning without asking, and she cleaned nothing in that house but the study, which she kept exactly as Don Matteo had left it, the blanket folded on the chair, the notebook on the sill, the small china cup she had carried tea in still ringed faintly with the last tea he had never finished, and every morning she opened the window a finger's width so the room could breathe. She learned the trucking business from the inside because Salvatore asked her to, and because a woman who could read a briefcase could also read a ledger, and because her grandmother's notebook had made it plain that a Vitale woman who did not understand the numbers around her was a Vitale woman waiting to be lied to. She sat in on meetings in the parlor. She said little. When she did speak, men listened, because they remembered the sound of a crystal decanter breaking a wrist. Vincenzo Palermo's name was not spoken in the house again. What became of him was not something Delia asked about, and not something Salvatore ever told her. "There are things a Vitale woman does not need to know," her grandmother's notebook said in one of its last pages, and Delia had learned to trust that notebook more than she trusted the evening news. In the spring, on the anniversary of the day she had first spoken the word in the study, Salvatore walked her out to the garden and asked her, in careful Sicilian, if she would consider making the arrangement permanent, and she said, in careful Sicilian, that she would consider it, and then she took his hand and considered it out loud for the next hour, which was the longest she had ever heard him listen to a woman speak without interrupting. They were married in the fall of the following year, in the small village church behind the estate, by the same priest who had prayed at Don Matteo's dinner and buried him 17 days later. Delia wore her grandmother's veil. She carried white oleander. She said her vows in Sicilian. When the priest asked if anyone in the church objected, no one breathed at all, because no man alive would dare. The story might have ended there, but Delia would not have called it a story if it did. Stories, her Nona had told her, do not end at weddings. Stories end when a woman looks around at the life she built with her own two hands and understands that she did not inherit it, she earned it, and no one in the room can take it from her. That morning came for Delia Russo Belandi on a Sunday in the following July, 1 year to the day after the dinner. She was sitting at the head of the long walnut table, in a chair no woman had ever been permitted to sit in, and around the table sat the same men who had watched Vincenzo Palermo draw his gun. They had come, this time, because she had called them. She had called them because there was a new contract on the trucking side, and she had questions, and Salvatore had said quietly, "Ask them yourself. They will answer you." She asked. They answered. And when the meeting was done and the men had risen to leave, the old uncle from Philadelphia, the one with the white mustache, kissed her hand at the door and said in Sicilian, "Signora Belandi, your grandmother would be proud." Delia said in Sicilian, "My grandmother is why any of us are still standing." He nodded once, and he left. Delia walked back through the dining room, past the sideboard where she had once dusted crystal, up the wide staircase where a woman named Rosaria had been pushed to her death, and down the long hall to the study on the second floor. She opened the door. She stepped inside. The room was full of afternoon light. The chair by the window was empty, but the blanket was folded on it, and the notebook was on the sill, and on the small table beside the chair was the gold locket, open, Rosaria's face inside, dark hair still tucked behind the photograph. Delia sat down in the chair. She put her hand on the notebook. She looked out the window at the garden, where the fountain was running, and the oleander was in bloom, and a groundskeeper was whistling, and a cook was hanging laundry, and a Mafia boss was walking slowly up the path with 2 coffees in his hands, and a look on his face that had nothing to do with the family business. And Delia Russo Belandi, 35 years old now, curvy, widowed once and married once and afraid of no man alive, said the word one last time, softly, to no one, and to everyone, and to a grandmother 11 years in the ground who had known, all along, exactly what she was doing. Scioreri. The truth was up, the shame was down, and the house, at last, was hers.